Every time a child was born in the tiny town of Willow Creek, a quiet, elderly black gardener named Mr. Elijah Green walked to the edge of the fields with a single sapling. He would plant it gently in the earth, no audience, no applause, and whisper, "May you grow together." People laughed at him. They called it silly, useless, even crazy, but Elijah never stopped. Over 20 years, he planted more than 1,000 trees. Then one scorching summer, when the rivers dried and the land cracked beneath their feet, Willow Creek faced a disaster that could have ended it forever. And that's when everyone realized Elijah's silly trees were the only reason they were still alive. Willow Creek was not the kind of place where great legends were born. It was a sleepy town, hidden in a valley where dusty roads split into winding trails, and old brick houses leaned on each other like tired elders. The people of Willow Creek were simple: farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, and tradesmen. Life was slow, predictable, and ordinary. And yet, within this quiet town, lived a man whose ordinary actions would one day be remembered as extraordinary. His name was Elijah Green. Elijah was not wealthy, not powerful, and certainly not someone most townsfolk paid much attention to. He was an old black man, hunched with age, who lived alone in a small wooden shack on the outskirts of town. His clothes were always patched, his boots worn thin, and his back bent from decades of labor in the fields. But if you saw him from a distance, there was one thing you'd always notice. Elijah always carried a small shovel, a pouch of seeds, or a fragile sapling tucked carefully under his arm. People used to joke, "There goes Elijah again, talking to his trees." The habit began many years earlier, when a tragedy reshaped Elijah's life. He had once been a field hand for a wealthy landowner, tending crops under a blistering sun for little more than scraps. He had no family of his own. His wife had died young, and their only child had not survived infancy. The grief carved deep lines in his face and left him wandering, searching for something to fill the silence. One summer evening, as Elijah worked in the fields, he heard cries from the small town nearby. A baby had just been born. The family, overjoyed, held a small celebration. Elijah watched from a distance, unseen, and something inside him stirred. That night, he walked into the woods with a small sapling he had nursed quietly in a clay pot. He dug a hole under the pale moonlight, placed the tree inside, and whispered, "Grow strong, little one. Grow with the child. May you both see the same seasons, the same storms, the same sun." It was a prayer, a silent wish, something he never told anyone about. From that night onward, it became his mission. Every time news spread that another child had been born in Willow Creek, Elijah would go to the edges of town, carrying another sapling. He planted it as though it were a sacred duty. Sometimes he planted one tree, sometimes 3, depending on the strength of his back and the weight of the soil. The townsfolk noticed. At first they found it curious, even harmless. But as years passed, they began to scoff. Why plant trees for babies? Will they even remember? That old man's gone soft in the head. He wastes his days digging holes while the rest of us work for real. But Elijah never answered. He smiled faintly and kept digging. For him, it wasn't about recognition. Each tree was a gift, a blessing, a silent bond between him and the children of Willow Creek. Willow Creek was not kind to Elijah. Though he had lived there his entire life, many still saw him as an outsider. Old prejudices clung to their whispers. He was tolerated, not embraced. Children sometimes mocked him, throwing stones as he carried his saplings, shouting, "Tree man! Crazy tree man!" Shopkeepers sold to him reluctantly, giving him seeds that others didn't want. When he asked for water to help his saplings survive, many laughed and told him to fetch it from the river himself. But Elijah carried on, quietly, steadily. He worked odd jobs to buy saplings, patching roofs, mending fences, tending fields for pennies. And whatever he earned, he spent not on himself, but on his trees. While the rest of the town built houses, argued politics, or planned festivals, Elijah was in the fields, under the sun, his hands covered in dirt. Years rolled by. Children grew into teenagers, and with them, Elijah's trees grew taller, thicker, stronger. What started as a scattered collection of saplings slowly turned into groves. Little patches of green sprouted near farms, around streams, at the edges of roads. Over time, they spread into something much bigger, a young forest, breathing life around the town, and yet few noticed. To most, the trees were simply background, silent, unimportant. To Elijah, however, they were family. Every morning, he walked among them, touching their trunks, murmuring softly, as though speaking to the children they represented. "You're strong now, Samuel. You've weathered the winter well. Grow tall, Maria. Reach for the sky. Stay rooted, David. Stay steady." The townsfolk shook their heads. They thought him mad. One autumn day, a group of young men followed Elijah into the woods. They laughed as he planted another sapling, mocking his bent posture and dirty hands. "Who are you planting this one for, old man? Another ghost child?" They jeered. Elijah didn't answer. He pressed the soil gently around the fragile roots and whispered his blessing. The boys, frustrated by his silence, kicked at the dirt, spat near the sapling and walked away, laughing. Elijah stayed behind, smoothing the soil again, whispering as though he hadn't heard them. His heart ached, but he never let their cruelty stop him, because deep inside, he believed something they could not yet see. One day, the trees would matter. When asked why he planted so many trees, Elijah would sometimes reply with words that confused people. "Someday, these trees will save you. Someday you'll understand why they're here." But no one took him seriously. They called it superstition, the ramblings of a lonely old man. To them, trees were just wood, firewood to burn, timber to sell, shade for lazy afternoons. No one could imagine that one man's devotion, one man's stubborn love for the earth, would one day hold the power to decide whether the entire town lived or died. 2 decades passed. By now, Elijah was frail, his hair silver, his steps slower. Yet he never stopped. Children who had once laughed at him were now adults, raising families of their own. And though many had forgotten, Elijah remembered every single one. Every birth, every child, every tree. The groves had grown thick and lush. Birds sang in branches. Streams flowed clearer where roots held the soil together, and cool shade stretched over fields that once baked in the sun. Still, Elijah lived quietly. He did not demand gratitude. He did not ask for recognition. He simply kept planting. But beneath the quiet life of Willow Creek, change was coming. Summers grew hotter. The river that had always fed the town began to dry. Wells grew shallow, crops brittle. People muttered about bad luck, about curses, about moving away. Few realized the truth. The land was dying, but Elijah knew. He had seen it in the soil, felt it in the roots, and he knew the trees were the only chance Willow Creek had left. The year began like any other. Spring in Willow Creek was a season of green hills and gentle rains. Children played barefoot in muddy streets, farmers tilled their land, and traders filled the market square with grain, fruit, and laughter. The townsfolk lived as though nothing could ever change. But Elijah Green knew better. He had watched the skies carefully, felt the heat in the earth, and sensed something wrong in the wind. The rains came later than usual. The river ran thinner. By the time summer arrived, the air was heavier, drier, and unforgiving. And then the drought began. The first signs, at first, no one worried. Farmers muttered about the heat but said, "It will rain soon." It always does. But weeks passed. The skies remained clear, pale, and merciless. Crops began to wither. Cornfields shrank, their green leaves curling into brittle brown husks. Wells that had always quenched the town's thirst began to recede, their stone bottoms appearing like the bones of a dying beast. Livestock grew thin, searching for water in dry troughs. The people grew restless. Mothers stood in lines at the town's lone well, waiting with clay pitchers that grew heavier with disappointment each passing day. Children cried for water, their lips cracked, their bellies empty. By midsummer, whispers spread like wildfire. The river is gone. Desperation in the town. The once bustling market grew silent. Traders who brought goods from other towns stopped coming. Their own villages were struggling too. Food prices soared. Families rationed meals, breaking bread into slivers. stretching milk with water until it was no more than pale liquid. The heat was merciless. Days blurred into a haze of dust and sweat. Even the strongest men staggered under the sun, their backs breaking in fields that no longer bore fruit. And at night, as the town sat in silence, prayers rose. Some begged for rain, others cursed fate. A few muttered darkly that maybe the land was cursed, that maybe Elijah Green's strange planting rituals had angered God. Elijah heard their words, but he did not respond. Instead, every dawn, he walked into his groves with buckets of water he had saved for days, dripping it slowly onto the roots of his trees. While the fields burned under the sun, Elijah's trees stood resilient. Their leaves shimmered green when everything else faded. Birds still sang in their branches. The soil beneath them remained moist, cool to the touch. Few noticed at first. To most, the groves were just that crazy old man's forest. But as the weeks dragged on, a strange contrast appeared. Where Elijah's trees grew, the air was cooler, the ground damp. Small streams that had long dried outside the forest still trickled faintly within its shade. Children who wandered too close returned amazed. "It's cooler there," they whispered. "There's water under the trees." Adults dismissed them, but unease stirred. By late summer, the disaster was undeniable. Entire fields turned to dust. Farmers abandoned their crops, their eyes hollow, their barns empty. Livestock died by the dozens, carcasses stiff under the unforgiving sun. Families began to leave Willow Creek, carrying what little they had on their backs. They sought refuge in neighboring towns, but soon heard those towns were struggling too. The drought was wide, merciless, and unending. Hunger became a shadow in every home. Children no longer laughed in the streets. Their cheeks grew gaunt, their energy drained. Parents wept silently at night, unable to feed their little ones. And still, Elijah planted. The mockery turns to anger. The townsfolk, once amused by Elijah, grew angry. "Look at him," they spat. "Wasting water on trees while our children starve." Groups of men confronted him in the fields. "Old man, stop this foolishness. Every drop you give to a tree could save a child's throat." Elijah listened, his face calm. Then he replied softly, "Without these trees, none of you will survive." "You think I waste water? These roots keep the ground alive. These leaves cool the air. You'll see. You'll all see." But they scoffed, called him mad, and walked away. Still he continued. His frail hands dug holes in the dry earth, his cracked lips whispered blessings, and his buckets of water trickled into the soil. The breaking point came when a young boy, no more than 8 years old, died from thirst and hunger. His mother wailed in the town square, clutching his thin body, crying, "Why won't the heavens give us rain? Why is this happening?" The town gathered in grief, in silence, in anger. And when they looked up, their eyes fell on Elijah, carrying yet another sapling to the edge of his grove. Fury erupted. Some shouted that he was to blame, that he wasted water while children died. Stones were thrown. His shack was vandalized. The people demanded he stop. Elijah stood still. His body shook, but his voice remained steady. "I plant because one day these trees will save you. You may curse me now, but you will bless me later." And he walked back into his grove, bleeding from a cut on his forehead where a stone had struck him. The weeks dragged on, and the town grew weaker. Food was gone. Wells were nearly dry. And yet, strangely, inside Elijah's forest, there was still life. A group of desperate women ventured there, carrying pitchers. They dug near the roots, and to their shock, water seeped up through the soil. They filled their pitchers, their children drank, and hope flickered for the first time in months. Word spread quickly. "There's water in Elijah's forest." At first people were skeptical, but desperation pushed them to follow. Soon families began to gather in the groves, digging small wells between the roots, finding water where none remained elsewhere. The same men who had mocked Elijah now returned in silence, humbled, their eyes filled with guilt and awe. By autumn, Willow Creek had all but abandoned its barren fields. Families camped within Elijah's groves, their homes now clusters of tents beneath the trees. The shade cooled them. The soil yielded water. The forest became their shelter, their lifeline. Children who once threw stones at Elijah now followed him eagerly, watching as he planted new saplings. He taught them how to dig carefully, how to water sparingly, how to protect the young roots. For the first time, Elijah was no longer mocked. He was listened to, respected, even revered, and yet he never claimed victory. He never scolded them with, "I told you so." He simply smiled, his weathered hands guiding sapling after sapling into the soil. But just as hope returned, a new danger arrived. That autumn, lightning struck in the distance, igniting a fire in the dry hills beyond the town. Flames spread quickly, feeding on brittle grass and abandoned farms. Smoke filled the skies. The people panicked. With no river, how could they stop the fire? The wind shifted, driving the flames toward Willow Creek. Families prepared to flee, believing the end had finally come. But when the fire reached Elijah's forest, something extraordinary happened. The trees slowed it. Their green leaves, heavy with moisture, did not burn as easily as dry fields. The thick canopy trapped sparks. The damp soil refused to ignite. The flames circled, raged, but could not consume the groves. Willow Creek survived, protected by the very trees Elijah had planted for decades. When dawn came, smoke still lingered, but the town was safe. Families emerged from the groves, their eyes wide with realization. The crazy old man had been right all along. His trees had saved them not once but twice, first from thirst, then from fire. Children clung to him. Mothers wept at his feet. Fathers bowed their heads in shame. And for the first time in his life, Elijah Green, the man who had been ignored, mocked, and despised, stood as the quiet savior of Willow Creek. For weeks after the fire, Willow Creek lived in Elijah's groves. The people grew used to their new lives under the trees, cooking in makeshift tents, drawing water from shallow wells dug near roots, sleeping beneath the shade. And though their survival was fragile, they believed the worst had passed. But nature was not finished with them yet. Late one evening, strange clouds gathered above Willow Creek. At first, people rejoiced. "Rain, at last, rain!" they cried, lifting their faces to the sky. Mothers clutched their children, whispering prayers of gratitude. But Elijah did not smile. His old eyes narrowed as he watched the horizon flicker with lightning. He had seen storms before, but this one felt different, angrier, heavier, more dangerous. By nightfall, the skies opened with fury. Rain poured not in blessing but in punishment. Sheets of water hammered the land, pounding soil into mud. Winds howled, ripping at tents and pulling roofs from houses. And then came the flood. The dry, cracked land that had begged for water now rejected it, unable to absorb the sudden deluge. Rivers that had disappeared months earlier roared back with monstrous force, swelling and overflowing. Torrents of water swept down from the hills, surging into Willow Creek. Streets turned into rivers. Houses crumbled under the weight of water. Families screamed, clutching whatever they could as the flood tore through the town. Panic spread like wildfire. People scrambled to higher ground, but the water rose too fast. The very town they had built for generations was being washed away in a single night, and once again their eyes turned toward Elijah's forest. As the floodwaters raged, something incredible happened. Elijah's trees, those groves planted with decades of patience, formed a barrier. Their thick roots held the soil together, preventing it from collapsing. Their trunks slowed the water, breaking its violent force. Pools formed within the forest, absorbing the flood, dispersing it before it could wipe out everything in its path. Families rushed into the groves, holding their children above the water, clinging to the roots. Gasping in terror, the forest was their only refuge. The same trees mocked for years were now the only reason Willow Creek had not been erased from the earth. But amidst the chaos, Elijah was missing. When families called his name, no answer came. Finally, a young boy spotted him, the old man wading waist-deep in water at the edge of town. In his arms, he carried a bundle of fragile saplings, struggling to keep them above the flood. "Elijah."
"Leave them!"
"Come back!" voices cried. But Elijah shook his head, his voice barely audible above the storm. "These are for tomorrow." The flood pressed harder. His frail body swayed. Yet he refused to let go of the saplings. Each one represented a child, a future, a promise. Even as water pulled at his legs, he staggered forward, planting them into the wet soil, his trembling hands pressing earth around fragile roots. With each sapling, he whispered the same prayer he had whispered for decades. Grow strong, little one. Grow with the child. May you both see the same seasons, the same storms, the same sun. The storm intensified. A surge of water barreled down, slamming into the town's edge. People screamed as the wave approached, ready to sweep away everything in its path. And then Elijah stood tall, one last time. With a strength that seemed to come from the earth itself, he pressed the final sapling into the ground, his hands sinking into the mud. The wave struck. The townsfolk watched in horror as Elijah disappeared beneath the water. His shovel clattered against a stone, then was gone. For a moment, silence. Only rain, only thunder. Then, slowly, the water receded, breaking apart against the wall of trees he had planted. The groves bent but did not break. The forest held. Willow Creek was saved. But Elijah Green, the quiet gardener, the man they had mocked, the man they had cursed, was gone. When dawn broke, the storm finally ended. The town was devastated. Houses ruined, streets drowned, belongings lost. But the people were alive. The groves still stood, strong and proud, the water caught in pools and basins around their roots, and among the mud, the people found the bundle of saplings Elijah had carried. Some had been planted, others remained wrapped in cloth. The townsfolk gathered them gently, their hands shaking, their tears mixing with the rain. The old man had given his last breath, not for himself, but for the future. From that day forward, Willow Creek was never the same. The people rebuilt, but differently this time. They no longer mocked Elijah's work, they continued it. Every child born after the great storm was honored not just with a name, but with a tree. Parents carried saplings into the groves, planting them with care, whispering Elijah's old blessing, and when children asked, "Why do we plant trees when I am born?" Parents answered with reverence, "Because a man who loved us more than we deserved gave his life planting trees for you." Elijah Green never had children of his own, but he left behind the greatest family of all, a forest of thousands, each tree carrying his blessing, each child tied forever to his devotion. The townsfolk built a statue at the grove's entrance, not of a king, not of a soldier, but of a humble man with a shovel in his hand and a sapling in his arm. Beneath it they carved the words, "He planted so we could live." And in the whispers of wind through the leaves, in the shade that cooled weary travelers, in the water that trickled from roots, the people of Willow Creek swore they could still hear him. Grow strong, little one. Grow with the child. May you both see the same seasons, the same storms, the same sun. The storm was over, for 3 days and nights. Rain had lashed Willow Creek until it seemed the heavens themselves were determined to wash the little town away. But when the clouds finally broke, when the morning sun rose pale and trembling over the horizon, what remained standing shocked the townsfolk more than what had been lost. The houses were wrecked, their timbers scattered across the sodden earth. Streets had disappeared into rivers of mud. Belongings, chairs, pots, rugs, toys, lay tangled in branches where the water had carried them. Families wandered dazed among the wreckage, barefoot, clutching one another. But amidst the ruin, Elijah's forest stood, tall, proud, defiant. The trees rose like guardians. Their branches dripped with water, their roots clung stubbornly to the soil, their trunks carved the flood into harmless streams. Pools sparkled at their bases, reflecting the weary sun. Birds returned as if summoned, filling the broken silence with their cautious songs. It was not the town's houses that had saved them. It was not their barns or their tools. It was the very thing they had mocked, ridiculed, and tried to destroy, the old man's trees. At first, no one spoke of Elijah. The people were too numb. They moved like shadows, gathering what little food remained, searching for missing belongings, comforting their frightened children. But as they worked, whispers began. "Has anyone seen him?" "Elijah, maybe he's in the groves." I saw him by the water, carrying saplings. The whispers grew into a painful realization. Elijah Green, their strange, stubborn neighbor, the man they had called foolish and crazy, was gone. Swept into the flood with nothing left but the memory of his struggle and the grove he had built for them. When the truth settled, the town wept. Men who had once mocked him sat with their heads in their hands. Women who had cursed his stubbornness sobbed openly, holding their children closer. Children who had tugged at his sleeves and giggled at his patience now cried because the old man who had always smiled at them would never again. But even in their grief, they felt his presence. The groves rustled softly in the morning breeze, leaves trembling, as if they carried the voice of the man who had given everything for them. They never found Elijah's body. The flood had taken him, just as it had tried to take the town. So the townsfolk built him a grave anyway. At the heart of the grove, where the earth was high and dry, they chose the tallest oak, one Elijah had planted nearly 40 years earlier. Its roots stretched wide, its branches reached toward heaven, its trunk was scarred but unbroken. There, at its base, they placed a stone. Chiseled into it were words as plain and humble as the man himself. He planted so we could live. Children brought flowers. Mothers brought jars of water to pour over the roots. Fathers placed their tools in the soil beside it, swearing to work with the same patience Elijah had. And though his body was gone, the people swore his spirit had simply melted into the roots, risen into the branches scattered with the seeds. He was everywhere in the forest now, in every leaf, every bird, every drop of dew. It was the children who began the tradition. One small girl, clutching a muddy sapling Elijah had dropped during the storm, planted it beside the stone. She patted the soil with her tiny hands, whispering the prayer Elijah had once taught her when she helped him in the groves. Grow strong, little one. Grow with me. See the sun and the storms as I do. The adults stood in silence. Tears ran down weathered faces, and then, one by one, they followed her example. Every family brought a sapling, some that Elijah had once prepared, others freshly cut from the forest. They planted them beside his oak, each one for a child, each one for a new beginning. The grove became not just Elijah's legacy, but the town's sacred heart. When Willow Creek began to rebuild, it did not look the same. Before, the town had turned its back on the groves, building houses on flat open land, fields stretching wide into the distance. But now the groves became their center. Families built homes on higher ground, weaving their lives among the trees. Instead of cutting wood carelessly, they learned from Elijah, planting two for everyone they took. The people dug new wells at the forest edge, where roots drew water closer to the surface. They built water channels inspired by the pools Elijah had shown them, guiding the streams into safe reservoirs. They raised barns and mills near the trees, trusting the shade to cool their work and the roots to anchor their earth. No one laughed at the groves anymore. They were life itself, a promise etched into the soil. Years passed. Children grew. New families were born, and as each child grew old enough to understand, they were told the story of Elijah Green. Around fire pits, beneath the groves, elders spoke with reverence. There was once a man who saw further than any of us. We mocked him, called him foolish, tried to tear down what he built. But when the earth turned against us, it was his patience, his stubborn love, that saved us. He gave his life so we could live. The children would listen, wide-eyed, clutching the trunks of the saplings planted in their names. Some would whisper the old prayer before bed, just as Elijah had. Grow strong, little one. Grow with me. And in this way, Elijah never truly died. His story rooted itself into every generation, passed on like sunlight through branches, never fading. As years turned into decades, travelers passed through Willow Creek. They came seeking trade or refuge or simple curiosity. And when they saw the groves, when they heard the story of the man who planted a forest for others, they carried the tale beyond the town. Soon, other villages began planting their own groves. In times of drought, in seasons of flood, they looked to Elijah's example. Farmers taught their children to plant a tree whenever a child was born, to tie the growth of life to the growth of the earth. Elijah's legacy spread far beyond Willow Creek. His name became legend, not in books, Not in songs of kings or generals, but in living, breathing forests that shaded children who never knew his face. 100 years later, Willow Creek was unrecognizable. Where once it had been a small, struggling town, it was now a thriving community woven into the heart of a vast forest. The groves Elijah had planted had grown into mighty woods, stretching for miles. Birds of every color nested there, streams ran clear and strong. Flowers bloomed in wild abundance. The townsfolk called it the Eternal Forest. At its heart still stood Elijah's oak, towering over all, its branches heavy with centuries of wisdom. At its base, the stone remained, weathered by time but never broken. He planted so we could live. And whenever a child was born, their family still carried a sapling into the grove. With solemn joy they planted it, whispering Elijah's prayer. Each new tree was not just a life but a vow, that they would never forget the man who gave them everything. On still nights, when the wind moved gently through the trees, some claimed they could hear Elijah's voice, not a ghost, not a spirit, but a whisper woven into the leaves themselves. Grow strong, little one. Grow with the child. May you both see the same seasons, the same storms, the same sun. And when the people heard it, they did not fear. They smiled, placing their hands on the bark of their trees, feeling the warmth of life that pulsed beneath. Elijah was gone. But Elijah was everywhere. Elijah Green had been mocked, abandoned, forgotten in life. Yet, in death, he became more eternal than kings, more powerful than armies. Not because he sought power or glory, but because he sought only to plant, patiently, quietly, stubbornly. The people of Willow Creek learned too late, but they learned well. Greatness is not in what we take for ourselves, but in what we plant for those who come after. And so long as the eternal forest stands, so long as its roots drink water and its branches stretch toward heaven, Elijah Green's name will never be lost, because every tree is a memory,